This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We're kicking off this Friday's program with K-State grain market economist Dan O'Brien. He covers the effects of the most recent crop production report, the ongoing drought in South America, the threat of a railway strike yet again, and Russia potentially not renewing the Black Sea grain agreement. Also ahead, K-State Associate Professor in Food Science, Valentina Trinetta, discusses her research inspired by Salmonella outbreaks in the pet food industry. In addition, Greg Aldrich, Professor and Director of the Pet Food Program here at K-State, previews KibbleCon and shares the ways the pet food industry benefits Kansas agriculture. We round out the week with our agricultural weather report from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. He shares that parts of the state received some precipitation this past week, welcomes in cooler weather, and says goodbye to 100-degree temps. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now, and as always, we have joining us Dan O'Brien. He is a K-State grain economist. So, Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Samantha. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So we have a ton to cover here. So let's start first and foremost. We kind of previewed this last time we chatted, but the crop production report that came out and then the WASDE report, there was some major implications of those. Let's chat through them.
Well, to start first with the corn production number, the USDA did come out with a slight lowering, a moderate lowering of their corn yield figure. It was 172.5 bushels per acre in the U.S. They dropped that down to about 171.9. And you think in the bigger picture things, that's not that much, but it does take the U.S. number down just a little bit lower. It was about 13.9495 billion bushels. Now it's down to 13.895, so 50 million bushels less. And as that number wound its way through the supply-demand balance sheet, we now see the USDA's projection of ending stocks down to 1.17 billion bushels. As you and I have talked about it a number of times in the past, we're getting closer and closer down to 1 billion bushels, which, if nothing else, is at least a psychological barrier. The USDA did see fit to raise its projected price to $6.80. That's up a nickel from where it was before. Even so tight times, from that pricing point of view, we still see in basically mid-October, we're seeing basis levels in all of Kansas strengthening. And you just don't see that in the midst of harvest in any type of a normal year. Normally, we'd have supplies coming in, probably overwhelming local storage, and that's not the case now. We're busily trying to get hold of any grain that we can. And so we're talking about a day yesterday where the futures went up and the basis is strengthening at the same time. So classic short crop situation. While we're talking corn, they're planting corn down South America, and particularly concerns out of Argentina with dryness. And a lot of the hopes of the world corn market working its way out of this tight situation that we also have in terms of global stocks rests on success coming out of South America. So we are hoping that La Nina does diminish as we get past the first of the year, but we still have to get through it now and get those first crops down there planted and have a possibility of success, and the hope that for corn and for soybeans that we'd be able to rebuild stocks.
Absolutely. And, the corn market wasn't the only thing that was affected by these reports. There's been similar outcomes for wheat as well, correct?
Well, yes, wheat's affected. The production numbers came out in the September 30th annual small grains crop production summary. So we brought those numbers forward now into the current supply-demand balance sheet. And we look at the wheat figures. We're looking at U.S. wheat ending stocks at 576 million bushels. And, what does that mean? Well, it's a number that's down from 669 million the previous year. We had ending stocks to use of 34.9, basically 35% last year. With these new numbers, we're down to 30.9 actually, dropped about 34 million bushels. So with corn, a crop that we feed to livestock, run through ethanol plants, etc., we live and tolerate 10% stocks to use, or where we're at now, about 8.3. But for wheat, given the food grain aspect of it and the closeness of taking wheat as a raw product into mills right to human consumption, we get pretty worried when we're 31%. If we get below that, then you're having a lot of concern with the United Nations and all these countries around the world in terms of gaining adequate supply. So we're tight on the wheat market. And the USDA did, in response to what's happening now in the overall broader economy, they did come in with a projection of 775 million bushels U.S. wheat exports. with the idea that as the U.S. federal government and the Federal Reserve in particular raises interest rates to combat inflation, and by the way, yesterday we came out with reports on the national level of some of the highest inflation we've seen in a good long time. A lot of concerns that interest rates be raised even farther in a strong manner by the Federal Reserve. And as interest rates go up, the U.S. dollar tends to go higher, and you just provide a lot of disincentive for other countries to buy U.S. wheat. It just makes us more expensive relative to other suppliers. But I guess I'd come back and say, though, I hear all that talk, and I see what the USDA did in terms of lowering their exports, but yet on a weekly basis came in with another week, 20 million bushel plus U.S. wheat exports, even with high price cash prices domestically and the higher U.S. dollar. So eventually what must be planned on from the USDA is that we'll eventually tail off in terms of our weekly exports and really start to suffer on that side. But for about 5-6 weeks now, that hasn't been the case. So I guess the tail of the tape will be as we keep going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, months into the future. Do we see Kansas wheat basis levels start to run up because elevators are demanding wheat to have in place to fill trains and do whatever else? And as you and I were talking earlier, there are some issues with regard to trains and rails that we need to consider as well.
Yes, yeah, that strike potential that we thought was resolved a few weeks ago is reared its ugly head back up. And of course, with that comes fear and anxiety surrounding that, especially when we think about things that are going on in the Mississippi River currently. So we're relying maybe even more so on our railway to transport some of these grains, especially here out of the Midwest. So, yeah, it's something that we'll continue to watch closely for sure, but we're all hoping and rooting for it to kind of just work itself out.
I could not have said it any better in that right now, because of dryness, the barge traffic down our central U.S. river system is constrained, slowed down at least, and we really are relying all that much more on the rail system to move grain to the Gulf or to move it around the country. In western Kansas, we're relying increasingly on the rail system to bring in quantities of corn out of the central corn belt to help, deal with our shortages from our dry weather we've had out here. So there's so much riding on the free flow of grain out of the central part of the nation into our area here in the central and southern Great Plains, western corn belt, that if we get to the place where there's the possibility of an increasing possibility of a strike happening, and which would be so disruptive to not just agriculture but a lot of things. I just would not be surprised at what type of action that governmental authorities might take to not let that happen. So to talk about rail labor politics beyond what Dan O'Brien knows, but I would say this is a big, big issue and surely something to watch. And what it would do, on the one hand, it would raise prices in some areas where we do have some supplies, whatever's available cash-wise, it would help. But in other areas, probably in the central corn belt, suddenly the demand for grain on the western corn belt can't be met by rails just because the trains aren't there. Then that basis drops.
Sure.
So you've had some real peaks and valleys happening in the U.S. grain markets, and we'd be yelling in the western corn belt because we can't get the grain. In the eastern central corn belt, they'd be yelling because their local prices drop so much because again their source of demand, i.e. rail to the western corn belt, suddenly is a stop. So let's hope that doesn't happen, I guess, is probably the best thing to say.
Yes, absolutely. And, we were talking about wheat here, and we didn't even mention all of the chaos going on in terms of Russia deciding whether or not they want to kind of extend that trade corridor agreement. It's looking like they're not going to be willing to.
Well, there's sure a lot of positioning and saber rattling going on right now. Antonina Boyaca in our shop in KSU AgEcon spoken about this recently in different settings. What I found out listening to Antonina speak is that some of the incentives that were given to Russia to allow that corridor to happen, to come into existence, were that they would have a free flow of their own grain out, and also that their flow of fertilizer, which, again, they're one of the primary, if not the primary, a seller of fertilizer products around the world, that their own flow of those two key agriculture-related products would be unhindered. So they had something come out of this as well. Well, their complaint, as you read their official statement coming through official channels to the UN, apparently was that, well, this hasn't happened. So to maintain that free flow of grain out of the Ukraine, it seems that UN, other major authorities, important authorities, need to address the Russian concerns. So here we're talking politics on a grain marketing-oriented broadcast, but that's what this is coming down to. Political conflict tied in with this geopolitical confrontation happening in the Black Sea region, and it just has a lot of impact. It does sound like when Ukraine comes out of this current situation, assuming that there's some stability, that their wheat production, latest numbers I heard, anticipate to be down about 50%. So there are long-term damages that have occurred, long intermediate term, I guess, I'd be optimistic, to Ukrainian agricultural production and their ability to move grain into the world market. I think in terms of world supply-demand numbers, we haven't talked a lot about the specifics for world ending stocks, but they're all affected by the inability of the world to have access to the grain that's produced in those areas. So lots to watch.
Absolutely, yeah. Hard to watch, obviously, from the standpoint of it just being markets that we're watching here, but also when you take into account kind of the humanitarian side of things as well, and you're thinking that, these are producers that have been producing wheat for many, many years, just like producers here in Kansas have been producing wheat for many, many years, and that might not be a possibility for them anytime soon. Or
at least not to the same degree. And countries that's probably suffer the most in this are those that aren't as strong economically, that can't afford to pay higher prices for some of these food products, and for them, these are all that much more of an acute crisis.
Absolutely, yes. But Dan, as always, I think we've covered everything. They had a long laundry list of things we wanted to get through today, but I think we did a great job of overviewing all of it.
Thank you, Samantha, for the opportunity to speak about this, and we'll continue to watch for this. The date for that in the Black Sea region is November 22nd, so I guess we'll find out if we go forward or not, and if not, then that'll certainly have impacts on the world markets.
Absolutely. Well, once again, that was Dan O'Brien. He is our K-State grain economist, joining us for this week's grain market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with a special guest in studio. Her name is Valentina Trinetta. She's a K-State Associate Professor in Food Science, and she's joining us today to talk about salmonella and pet food specifically. She's going to be talking about this exact subject at the upcoming KibbleCon event that we are hosting here in Manhattan. But Valentina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And like I said, we're speaking really about salmonella, which is an issue in terms of food safety across the board. It's not just in pet food, but your focus really is in the pet food industry.
It is in the pet food industry, and it is also in the meat industry. But yeah, my group have been working on salmonella in pet food and rendering fat since a couple of years. And what we did was trying to understand what are the conditions that allow salmonella to grow in these food matrices. We tried different type of moisture, different type of temperature and humidity, and our outcome was to identify what were the survival kinetic of salmonella when we were using this experimental condition. We wanted to give to the industry the possibility to understand when and how salmonella can grow, so they could be careful in not creating those conditions. And we observed that high temperature helps in decreasing the risk of contamination of salmonella, but the level of humidity and water unfortunately favor the growth of salmonella, and so we can have the risk of salmonella while transporting and storing these ingredients. So that's one part of the projects I will talk about during the conference next week. And the other topic that I will talk about is which intervention of cleaning and sanitation and they work against salmonella, especially in truck and tanks, again during transportation. We have been partnering with different stakeholders. They are very supportive of this new project. And so the first step is going to be do a survey and asking people in the field, what do you currently use? And then based on their response, we are going to do a field trial and verify the condition that allows Salmonella to be destroyed. And so we hope to really help the industry. My students are going to present also a poster on Salmonella biofilm, on stainless steel surface and plastic. We choose to work with Salmonella biofilm because they are more resistant to sanitation. And so if water or steam works against biofilm, then we are sure also against other type of sessile microorganisms. So,
excellent. Well, you were speaking beforehand, and you mentioned that this research was really inspired by some of the Salmonella cases that were seen in the pet food industry, repetitively for a while. And the pet food industry is held to such a high standard. So the fact that Salmonella was continuously almost seeming to be an outbreak, this research attests to the importance of that.
Yes. So as I say to my student, microorganisms are intelligent. And so Salmonella is a good case of microbial evolution. So the fact that Salmonella is not only able to live in moisture environment, but is able to adapt and live in dry environment or high temperature. That's the challenge for the pet and food industry, the fact that new microorganisms can adapt.
Absolutely. And your research is obviously answering some of these big topics in terms of transportation, but then also different surfaces, like you mentioned, what an impact this will really have in the industry. No wonder they're so supportive of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, this has been interesting also from the material science point of view or architecture of how a microorganism grow on different type of surfaces, because we see very different response based on the surface where the microorganism is allowed to grow.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Valentina Trinetta. She is an associate professor in food science here at K-State, highlighting her work in Salmonella in the pet food industry, but also talking about the upcoming KibbleCon event, which will be occurring next week. And now we are joined by Greg Aldrich. He is a professor as well as the director of the pet food program here at K-State. So, Greg, thanks for joining us.
Samantha, good morning. Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. So today you're really joining us because you're previewing this huge event that you have coming up very soon. It's KibbleCon.
Love that name, don't you? It's one of those things that's been in planning for now a couple of years, and it got derailed by the COVID pandemic. But in essence, it's an opportunity for us in the pet food program here at K-State to showcase some of the research, to showcase our students, and to interact with industry professionals. And we've been doing that every fall for about the last 6 years, but we've rebranded it this year to give it a little bit new excitement and flair. And hopefully we'll have some folks from the industry come in here in October 19, 2021 to visit us at the Bluemont Hotel.
Yes, quickly approaching. It's very exciting. And this is a huge part of, people might not realize it, but the agricultural industry and in Kansas specifically.
Yeah, it is. A lot of folks don't realize that pet food, of course, is a food product, and much of that is produced here in the Midwest. Kansas and Missouri are number 2 and number 1, but where most of the pet food is manufactured in the country. We have a lot of the raw material supplies. We have a great labor force, and it is about agriculture and value added. So it is a big part of our economy. Today, estimates are that we're in excess of 3,000 employed folks directly in the pet food manufacturing business. There's a number of multipliers there for the economy, and so we're pushing somewhere between $7 and $8 billion to the local economy.
Wonderful. And I know that there's a whole slew of events. Obviously, it's taking place over the course of 3 days here in Manhattan. So let's walk through some of those.
So starting out on Wednesday evening, we'll have a reception from 4 to 6, and that's an opportunity for everybody to get reconnected when they're coming back into town. Then on Thursday morning, we really start in earnest. We'll have a welcome reception with Dr. Rozowski with VPR's office, and he'll welcome folks to K-State. And then we'll kick off then with a couple of panels discussions. The first one's going to be about new product development and innovation. Then we'll move into talking about validation of products from a flavor, sensory, and palatability standpoint, and then also how the animal utilizes it with some friends from Hill's Pet Nutrition. During the midday, we're going to have one of the folks from Nielsen IQ to talk a little bit about trends in the industry while we're having our lunch, and then after that, we're going to get deeper into the science and the technology. extrusion, food safety with my colleague Valentina Trinetta to talk a little bit about some of her research. The extrusion process will be by Extrutech, so a noted expert and a supplier here in the state of Kansas. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the importance of packaging and sustainability with Umut Yücel, here a K-State faculty member in food science. And then we're going to round out the day with our presentations with a little bit of forecasting by Guy Allen out of the IGP group.
Wonderful. Well, obviously a star-studded lineup here when we're talking about not only those involved here at K-State in the pet food work that you guys do, but also just even industry-wide.
So we only got halfway through the program here.
That's true.
So, we'll close out with Ernie Minton on the afternoon, talk a little bit about some of the programs that we're seeing for new development here, the excitement on campus. And on Friday is when I get to finally talk to folks a little bit about sustainability and the circular bioeconomy and how that fits with pet food. And then we'll have a little competition amongst the graduate students for their research. So there's going to be a lot for anybody that has an interest in pet food.
It's wonderful for sure. And I know we have a special guest in studio that you've had joining us.
Do you want me to wake the beast?
Yes, go ahead. We'll introduce Luker.
Here, Luke, can you say hi? Oh, there you go.
So Luker, I'm sure, is saying everybody needs to come and attend this wonderful conference. And obviously, it's an important industry, not only for those involved in the production of it, but those that also consumers that enjoy it with their pets at home, too.
Exactly. So it's one of those interactions that we get to have with animals. There's so many health benefits and social benefits to being a pet owner. There's that side of it. But for agriculture, the real connection here is that most of the crops that we produce, we take them to a central location for manufacturing, and they get converted into a food product, whether it's flour or it's a steak. Only about half to 2/3 of that food product end up on our plate. And so there's 1/3 to a half that ends up going into what we'll call a co-product. And the pet food industry is a huge user of those co-products. If you want to think about it this way, pet food actually adds a floor or a basis to change the cost of food. And so for farmers, it actually raises their price, right? And for the consumer, you'd say, well, that's just raising the value to the farmer. That's not doing me any good. On the contrary, it actually lowers the cost of human foods because we have this intermediate, our companion animals, these creatures we love to have in our home. They're helping us with this whole notion of the whole package of what the value of food is from farm to the market.
Absolutely. A testament to how important this industry is and what an opportunity we have here at K-State as leaders in this industry in terms of research and all the work that goes into it.
Absolutely. We're the first big major push in pet foods and nutrition in the U.S. And so hopefully people start to recognize that it is truly providing value to Kansas agriculture and to our communities.
Absolutely. Well, Greg, I can't thank you enough for coming in and previewing this event. I'm sure listeners hopefully have enjoyed hearing from you and Luker as well.
You bet. Thank you for inviting us.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Greg Aldrich. He's an associate professor and the director of the K-State Pet Food Program. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are rounding out today's programming as we always do with our agricultural weather report. And joining us this week, we have with us Chip Redmond, our K-State meteorologist. So Chip, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So let's start, as we always do, with what really the past week has held. We had some rain from what I understand.
Yeah, we had some rain for the lucky folks in mostly northeast and eastern Kansas. Some areas that have missed out, like southeast Kansas, finally got a little taste. They haven't had rain for almost 30 days. Granted, it wasn't a significant amount. Most of the rainfall amounts were at average for the week to slightly below average. Southeast Kansas averages around 9/10 of an inch, where we have that gradient that decreases as we get to the northwest. They only average around 4/10 of an inch. So we're seeing our average precipitation decline, which is typical in the fall. So when we don't quite get average rainfall, we still build deficits, and most people did not exceed their average rainfall for the week. So needed moisture, a lot of it fell pretty quickly with thunderstorm activity, which is kind of getting rare as we get later into October. And it was short duration and it ran off a lot, so it didn't really soak into the ground as well as it could have. But regardless, needed moisture for an area of the state that hasn't gotten any for a while.
It's obviously cooled down quite a bit, which is welcome for a large portion of the state. What else have we really seen?
Yeah, so the temperatures have greatly decreased, and no more hundreds in the forecast. In fact, climatologically, hundreds would be very rare. So we had some cooler temperatures over the weekend, where a couple locations in the northeast part of the state saw freeze. Mm-hmm. Hiawatha, I think, spent about 9 hours below freeze and got down to 25. That's pretty cold for them, even this time of the year. Other than that, yeah, overall temperatures have been cooler than normal. Not significantly, but enough to be noticeable. And our average temperatures are falling each week as well. So even though we're 75 to 80 on the warm days, that's still above normal for where we're supposed to be. And so we'll take that, and at least there's less of a demand for moisture with cooler temperatures too.
And we've gotten, obviously, our wind has kind of started to pick up, but with that comes some concerns.
Well, we think about the cooler temperature being less of a demand for moisture. Well, we make up with that with wind. That obviously evaporates more moisture out of the atmosphere. And as a result, we have increased moisture demand. And we haven't had a ton of wind so far this fall. With these last few cold fronts, we've seen an uptick in it, as well as conditions that come with it. We've seen some blowing dust concerns increase. I know a lot of folks didn't get good crop growth this year. A lot of fields are more exposed than people would like, especially even pasture land. So blowing dust is a big problem that will likely get worse, unfortunately, as you go into later into winter. And then the fire concerns as well, where we've got drought-laden fuel basically grass and vegetation that can burn across the state at a higher intensity than normally expect. We haven't had a lot of wind, so we haven't really tested that very much. But now that we're adding wind to the picture with dry conditions, we are really concerned about wildfires across the state.
Absolutely, something to be mindful of for sure as we look ahead. And the forecast, once again, not very optimistic in terms of precipitation.
Yeah, it just struggle to find a chance of rain in the forecast right now. We're really stuck in this stagnant pattern that weakened briefly and then built right back in this week. And we had some hope of maybe one of the oscillations swinging in favor of increased moisture late October. Unfortunately, La Nina just continues to squish that oscillation, the MJO, and unfortunately that isn't going to come to fruition, and we're going to be hard-pressed to find any moisture likely through the end of the month. We're going to be talking about drought going into the spring.
Unfortunate news for sure, especially when we think about wheat starting to emerge. I know some of those numbers have come out, and they're not the best.
Yeah, well, people are able to get into the field and plant it, whether they're dusting it in or not, so that's a positive. And wheat is a resilient little crop, I'll tell you what. Last year proved it for a lot of folks. But it did have a breaking point last year. And one of the problems was wheat that did come up last year wasn't able to sustain itself long term. So that moisture helped get some of the wheat up, especially in the north central where they did get precipitation. But on average, we're behind wheat emergence for this time of the year. And I'm really concerned that the stuff that did come up doesn't have long-term subsurface soil moisture to support it. Definitely concerned of it not making it due to drier conditions.
Sure. Well, Chip, thank you so much for this update. I know listeners, probably not the news they were hoping to hear, but a great update nonetheless, so we appreciate your time.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond providing this week's agricultural weather update. We'll be back with more next week on Agriculture Today.